Tonight, I'll be sharing 3 true stories from people who didn't realize they were being watched until it was already too late. And in every case, the most disturbing part wasn't what happened. It was how long it had been happening before they noticed. Let's get started. I don't tell these stories to most people. I've tried a few times over the years, and there's a specific thing that happens when you do. The room gets quiet in a way that isn't polite. Someone laughs at the wrong moment. Someone else changes the subject before you've actually finished. After enough of that, you stop offering them up. You just carry them. But the 3 things I'm about to tell you all happened to me, or close enough to me that I was there for them. None of them have endings. None of them got solved. And the part that still bothers me, more than anything that actually happened, is how long each one had been going on before I noticed. By the time I understood I was inside something, I had already been inside it for a while. That's the part I want you to listen for. Not the moment I figured it out, the space before. The first one happened when I was 23, living alone in a 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a building that had 8 units total. It was an older building, brick on the outside, the kind of place that had been chopped up into apartments sometime in the 70s and hadn't really been updated since. The hallways smelled like old carpet and whatever anyone had cooked in the last 48 hours. The mailboxes in the lobby were the small metal kind with the little brass keys, and half of them didn't lock properly. I'd been there about a year when things started, long enough that I knew the building the way you know a building when you live in one. I knew the guy in 3B walked heavy on his heels, and you could hear him pacing at night sometimes when he was on the phone. I knew the woman next door to me dragged a kitchen chair across her linoleum every morning, around 6 the same chair, the same sound. I knew the front door of the building stuck in humid weather, and you had to lift the handle slightly to get the latch to catch. You stop hearing any of it after a while, it just becomes the sound of being home. I worked from home back then, data entry for a logistics company, basically just sitting at my laptop for 8 or 9 hours, feeding numbers into a system. The job didn't require a lot of brain power, but it required all of it at once, so by the end of the day I was usually pretty fried. I kept strange hours. I'd often work until late evening, then stay up until 2 or 3 in the morning watching shows, then sleep until 10 or 11 the next day. There was nobody to keep schedule for. My bedroom faced the back of the building, the alley side, and there was a small window above the bed that I kept cracked year-round because the radiator heat in that apartment was aggressive, and the only settings were full blast or off. The thing I noticed first was the smell. Not a bad smell. Cigarettes. I don't smoke, I never have, and nobody I knew well enough to have in my apartment smoked either. But some mornings I would wake up, and the bedroom would smell faintly of cigarette smoke. Not fresh, the stale kind. The kind that hangs in fabric. Like someone had been smoking somewhere nearby a few hours before, and the smell had drifted in. I told myself it was the alley. The kitchen staff from the restaurant on the corner used to stand back there on their breaks, and I could hear them sometimes through the cracked window, talking in Spanish, laughing, kicking pebbles around. It made sense that the smoke would drift up. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, and I held on to it for weeks. I want to say that clearly. I was not on alert. I was not suspicious. The smell was strange, but strange has a lot of normal explanations when you live in an old building in a city, and I had used up my supply of normal explanations. The second thing was smaller, and I almost don't want to mention it, because at the time it didn't register at all. I started finding the bathroom light on in the mornings, just sometimes. Maybe one morning out of every 5 or 6. I'd come out of the bedroom and the bathroom light would be on, and I'd stand there in the hallway for a second and try to remember if I'd used the bathroom in the middle of the night. Sometimes I had. Sometimes I genuinely couldn't remember. I'm someone who gets up to use the bathroom once or twice in a night and barely wakes up doing it, so for a long time I just assumed I'd forgotten to turn it off. People forget things at 3 in the morning. That's normal. Then one night I came home late from a friend's place, maybe 1 in the morning. I'd had 2 drinks over the course of about 5 hours, so I was completely sober, just tired. I came up the stairs, walked down the hallway, and when I put my key in my door, the deadbolt was already unlocked. The handle lock was still engaged, but the deadbolt, the big one, the one you have to turn with the key from the outside, was open. I stood there in the hallway with my key still in my hand, and I tried to remember. Locking it, I almost always double-locked. It was a habit, the way you brush your teeth without thinking. But I couldn't put my finger on the specific memory of doing it that night. I'd been in a rush going out. I'd had a phone call I was trying to finish before I left. It was possible I'd just turned the handle lock and forgotten the deadbolt. I went inside. I turned on every light. I walked through the apartment the way you do when you're pretending to be casual about checking for something. Living room, kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, closet. Nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed. My laptop was still on the kitchen table. The $40 I kept in a drawer was still in the drawer. Everything looked exactly the way I'd left it. I went to bed. I told myself I'd forgotten. People forget. That's what I kept saying. People forget. Here's the part that I think about now, that I didn't think about then. Whoever it was had not taken anything, which at the time made me feel better, which is exactly backwards. A thief takes things and leaves. Someone who comes in and doesn't take anything is coming in for a different reason. I didn't think that thought until much later. About a week after that, I was lying in bed reading on my phone, lights off, maybe 1:30 in the morning. The apartment was completely quiet, which it usually wasn't. Usually you could hear the guy upstairs, or the heating pipes ticking, or traffic on the street out front. But that night it was one of those weirdly still nights where the building seemed to be holding its breath. I was reading something stupid on my phone, half asleep, and I heard the floor creak. Not the hallway outside my apartment. The hallway. Inside. My apartment. The short stretch of hallway between my bedroom and the living room. I froze. The phone screen was still bright in my hand, and I remember thinking very clearly that the light from it was probably visible from out there. I didn't move. I waited. I counted in my head almost involuntarily. 1, 2, 3. I got to about 30 before I started breathing normally again. There was no second creak, no third. The apartment stayed completely silent. After maybe a full minute, I sat up, turned on the bedside lamp, and walked into the hallway. Nothing. The chain was on the front door. I'd put it on when I came home. The windows in the living room were locked. I checked the bathroom. I pulled back the shower curtain, which I felt ridiculous doing. I opened the front closet. I even, and I'm a little embarrassed to say this, opened the kitchen cabinets, the lower ones, like a child checking for a monster. There was nothing. The apartment was empty. Old buildings settle. That's a real thing. Wood expands and contracts. Floors creak at night because the temperature drops and the joists move. I'd read about this. I'd looked it up at some point. I don't remember when. So I told myself, the building is settling. I went back to bed. I left the lamp on for a while. The next morning, the bathroom light was on again. The thing about all of this, looking back, is that any single one of these incidents on its own is nothing. The smell, the lights, the deadbolt, the creak. Anyone reading them as a list would have known something was wrong, but I wasn't reading them as a list. I was living them one at a time, with normal life happening in between, and normal life is very good at smoothing over the seams. I had deadlines at work. I had a cousin getting married. I went on 2 dates. The strange things just sat there in the background, accumulating, and I kept finding ways to file each one under a category that didn't scare me. There were a few other things in the weeks after that I noticed but didn't act on. My toothbrush, one morning, was wet when I picked it up. Not damp from the night before. Wet like it had been used recently. I stared at it for a long time. I told myself I'd rinsed it after using it the night before, and that was the explanation. I'm not sure I actually believed that, but I told myself. Another time, the volume on my TV was set higher than I remembered leaving it. I'd been watching something quietly the night before on a low volume because I didn't want to bother the neighbors. When I turned it on the next afternoon, it came on loud, and I had to scramble for the remote. I sat there with my finger on the volume button thinking, I didn't leave it like that. And then thinking, well, maybe I did. Maybe I bumped the remote. Maybe one of the cats. And then remembering that I didn't have cats. The thing that finally made me move out happened about 3 weeks after the creak in the hallway. It was a Saturday afternoon. Bright sunlight coming through the windows. I was sitting on my couch eating cereal, watching something on my laptop, completely calm. The apartment looked beautiful in that light, actually. I remember thinking that. The way the sun came through the front window and made the dust visible in the air. I looked over at the bookshelf across the room, and I noticed that a book was sticking out about an inch farther than the others. A cookbook, hardcover, white spine. It had been a gift from my mother when I'd moved in, the kind of gift you accept warmly and then never use. I had put it on the shelf the day I moved in, between 2 other books my mother had also given me, and I had not touched it since. I am completely certain of this. It was a totem of my mother's hope that I would cook for myself, and it sat there as a reminder that I wasn't, and that was its entire function in my life. But it was forward of the rest of the row, not dramatically, maybe an inch, maybe a little less. The kind of thing you'd never notice unless you happened to be looking at it from exactly the angle I was looking at it from, with the sunlight hitting the shelf. I almost let it go. I want you to understand how close I came to just pushing it back in and moving on with my afternoon. I had a spoon halfway to my mouth. I was watching something interesting on my laptop. The book was probably just like that. I'd probably bumped the shelf at some point. I was about to push it back when something, and I don't know what, I really don't. I've thought about this a lot. Made me get up and walk over and pull the book off the shelf instead. I opened it. There was a piece of paper folded inside. Near the front, maybe 20 pages in, slipped between two recipes for things I would never make. Not a notebook page, a torn piece of regular printer paper, the kind that comes out of any office printer, folded twice, lengthwise and then crosswise, into a small rectangle. I unfolded it, standing right there at the bookshelf. My cereal was still on the couch. The laptop was still playing. On the paper in pencil, someone had written down a list of times, like a schedule. The handwriting was small and neat and was absolutely, completely not mine. I want to be clear about that. I looked at it for what felt like a long time, trying to make it be mine. Trying to remember some reason I might have written down a list of times on a piece of paper and hidden it in a book I never opened. I couldn't make it be mine. It wasn't mine. The entries went something like this, and I'm reconstructing from memory now, so the exact times might be off, but the structure was this: 7:40 a.m. out, 8:15 a.m. back groceries, 11 a.m. out, 12:40 p.m. back, 6:15 p.m. out, 7 p.m. back, 11:50 p.m. lights off. There were maybe a dozen entries in total. And then at the bottom, separately, almost like an annotation, the word Saturday, with a question mark after it. I was reading this on a Saturday. I have tried over the years to describe the specific feeling of that moment. The closest I can get is that it felt like the floor had become slightly transparent, like the apartment, which had been a real and solid place that I lived in, suddenly revealed itself as a stage set, and someone had been backstage the whole time, taking notes. The entries weren't random. They were my schedule. The grocery trip was a real grocery trip I made most weeks. The 11 o'clock window was when I usually went down to check the mail. The lights off at 11:50 was, if anything, conservative. I often stayed up later, but 11:50 was when I usually turned off the living room lamp and moved to the bedroom. Somebody had been watching me long enough to know my routine, long enough to write it down, and long enough to leave the paper somewhere they apparently expected to be able to come back to. I packed a bag that afternoon. I didn't run. I didn't panic. I just very methodically put some clothes and my laptop and my passport in a duffel bag, and I drove to my brother's place across town. And I told him I needed to crash for a few nights, because something was wrong with my apartment, and to his credit, he didn't ask. I gave notice on the lease the following Monday, and I moved out at the end of that month. Here's the part I'm not proud of. I never told the landlord about the paper. I never called the police. I threw the paper away. I don't know why. I think I was afraid that if I showed it to anyone, they would tell me there was an explanation, that maintenance had been in, that the previous tenant had left it, that I was misreading it, and any explanation that made it less scary would also have meant somebody had been inside my apartment more than once, and I wasn't ready to know that for certain. As long as the paper was gone, it could be a thing I had imagined. As long as I'd moved out, it didn't matter. But I think about that paper a lot. I think about the handwriting. I think about the question mark next to Saturday, which has always felt to me like the most disturbing part of the whole thing. Like someone was figuring me out. Like the weekdays were already solved, and the weekends were the parts still being studied. For years afterward, I had a habit. I would come home, unlock my door, and stand in the doorway for a full 10 or 15 seconds before going inside, just listening. I still do it sometimes. I'm 36 now. I have a different life, a different city, a partner, a dog. I still do it. I don't think I'm going to stop. The second story is shorter, and it happened to my sister. But I was there for parts of it, and I helped her move out at the end of it, so I think I have the right to tell it. She lived in a small house on a quiet residential street. The kind of street where every house looked basically like every other house, and everybody had a porch light, and nobody used them. She'd bought the place a couple of years before, in her late 20s, and she was proud of it in the specific way that people are proud of their first house. She had a dog named Rolo, medium-sized mutt, mostly some kind of retriever mix, the friendliest animal you've ever met. Rollo would bring his toy to a burglar. He had no concept of strangers. Everyone he met was his new best friend. He spent most of his days in the backyard, which my sister had fenced in with a 6-foot wooden privacy fence when she moved in, partly for him and partly because she liked the privacy. Beyond the fence was a narrow strip of grass, and then the back fence of the houses on the next street over. There was a small alley back there, used mostly for trash pickup. In the summer of 2019, my sister started noticing that Rollo would sometimes stand at the back fence and stare. Just stand there, not bark, not whine, not paw at the fence. Just stand and stare at one specific spot. He'd do it for 10 or 15 minutes at a time. She mentioned it to me on the phone one evening, kind of laughing about it, saying the dog had finally lost it after years of squirrel watching. I didn't think much of it. Dogs do strange things. I have a dog now and he stares at the dishwasher for reasons known only to him. But she started noticing more. She told me a few weeks later that Rollo had started waking her up in the night. He slept in her bedroom on a dog bed by the window. He'd never been a barker, but he'd started doing this thing where he'd lift his head, sit up slowly, and just stare at the window. Not bark, just look. She'd lie there in the dark watching him watch the window, and after a while he'd lie back down. She mentioned it almost as a joke, like, "My dog has decided to develop a personality at 6 years old." Then she found the first cigarette butt. She was mowing the lawn one Saturday, doing the back corner, and she saw something in the grass right up against the outside of her back fence. Inside the yard, on her side. She bent down to pick it up, and it was a cigarette butt, smoked down to the filter, fresh enough that the paper was still white. She thought about it for a second. None of her neighbors smoked as far as she knew. She didn't smoke. She wondered if it had blown in from the alley behind the next street over, although that didn't quite make sense given the layout. She picked it up, threw it in the trash, didn't think about it for the rest of the day. The next weekend, mowing again, there were 2 more. Same spot, right up against the fence, on her side. This was when she called me. She wasn't scared, she was annoyed. She said, "Somebody's hanging out behind my fence and flicking their butts into my yard. And it's so weirdly specific, like, why this one spot?" I told her to maybe peek over the fence next time she was out there, see if there was a path or something. She said she had, and there wasn't, just grass. A few days after that, she told me about the gate. She had a side gate on the fence, a tall wooden thing with a heavy iron latch. The latch had a little hook that dropped into a loop, and you had to lift the hook and swing the gate to open it. The gate was always latched. Always. She was militant about it because of Rollo. If the gate wasn't latched, Rollo could get out into the front yard and then into the street, and that was a thing she had been afraid of since the day she moved in. She came home from work one evening, and the gate was unlatched. Not open. Just unlatched. The hook was lifted out of the loop and sitting on top of it, like someone had opened the gate, then closed it without quite relatching it. She walked the yard. She checked the house. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was missing. No broken windows. Rollo was inside where she'd left him. She told herself maybe the wind had lifted the hook, although the hook was heavy and the wind that day had not been remarkable. She relatched the gate and that was it. But she started looking. That was the change. She started actually looking at her yard, the way you look at a place when you've decided something might be wrong with it. And once she started looking, she started finding things. There was a small depression in the grass near the back fence, about a foot from where the cigarette butts had been, that looked like it could have been a footprint, except it was vague enough that it could have also been nothing. There were 2 cigarette butts in the alley behind the house, on the public side, which was less strange but felt connected. There was a place on the inside of the fence where the wood looked slightly scuffed, low down, like maybe someone had braced a foot against it, or like maybe she was now seeing scuffs on a fence that had been there for years. She told me later that the hardest part of that period was not knowing whether she was discovering things or inventing them. She'd look at a mark on the fence and think, "That's evidence," and then she'd think, "No, that was probably always there." And then she'd think, "But I never noticed it." And then she'd think, "You never noticed it because you weren't looking. That doesn't mean it's new." Rollo's behavior at the fence got worse. He started doing it during the day now, not just at night. He'd go out and stand and stare, and his hackles would come up, just slightly, just along the ridge of his back. He still didn't bark. He just got tense. My sister said the most unnerving thing about it was that the dog had clearly decided something was there to be watched, and the dog wasn't wrong about things like that. Dogs don't invent, they just notice. She put up a camera, a cheap battery-powered one from a hardware store, the kind that records to an app on your phone when it detects motion. She mounted it on the back porch, pointing out at the yard, angled toward the back fence. For 10 days, nothing. She got notifications every time a raccoon walked through, every time the wind moved a branch, every time Rollo trotted across the lawn. She started to feel a little stupid about the camera. She started to think she'd been letting her imagination run. On the 11th night at 3:14 in the morning, the camera caught a person standing in her backyard. She showed me the footage. I've seen it. The resolution wasn't great. Night vision on those cameras turns everything into a grainy green wash, but it was clearly a person, adult-sized, wearing dark clothes and a hood pulled up, standing maybe 10 feet from the back fence, facing the house, not moving, not approaching, just standing there with his hands at his sides. He stood there for 43 seconds. I know because I counted later watching it. 43 seconds is a long time to stand still. Try it sometime in your kitchen just to see how long it is. Now imagine doing it in someone else's yard at 3 in the morning, facing their bedroom window. After 43 seconds, he turned around and walked back to the fence. He didn't run, he didn't even hurry, he walked. When he got to the fence, he reached up and put both hands on the top of it and pulled himself up and over in one smooth motion, swinging one leg over and then the other and dropped down on the other side. He'd done it before. You could tell by the economy of the movement. He knew exactly how tall the fence was, exactly where to grip, exactly how to land. The thing that bothered me most, watching it, was that he never looked at the camera. Either he didn't know it was there, or he knew exactly where it was and knew not to look. I couldn't decide which was worse. She called the police that morning. They came out, they took the footage, they walked the yard. They were polite and professional, and they did all the right things. They said they'd increase patrols in the neighborhood. They said the footage wasn't clear enough to identify anyone. They said to call them immediately if she saw anything else. They didn't find anything in the yard or the alley that helped them. The cigarette butts were too old by then. She moved in with our mom that weekend. She put the house on the market 2 months later. She didn't want to stay long enough to find out if he'd come back, and I don't blame her. When she was packing, I came over to help. We spent a whole Saturday boxing up books and dishes. Rollo was with us, and the whole day, every 15 or 20 minutes, he would walk over to the back door and stand and look out at the yard. He never barked. He never whined. He just looked. I watched him do it maybe a dozen times over the course of that day, and each time I caught myself wondering what he was hoping to see, or what he was hoping not to see. I asked her once, a year or so later, if she'd ever found out anything more. She said no, not really. She said the real who'd sold her the house had mentioned, in passing, that the previous owner had also sold quickly and had complained about feeling watched. The realtor had presented this as a quirky anecdote. My sister had not, at the time, asked any follow-up questions because she hadn't yet had a reason to. She thought about reaching out to the previous owner after everything happened to compare notes, and she decided not to. She said she didn't want to know if it was the same person. She said if it was, she'd have to think about how long he'd been doing this and to how many people, and she wasn't prepared to carry that. The third story is mine again. Less happened in it than in the other two. I want to say that up front. By any objective measure, this is the smallest of the three, and it's the one I think about the most. About 4 years ago, I was driving home from a work trip, a long one. I'd been gone almost a week, and I was driving back rather than flying, because I'd brought too much stuff to fly comfortably, and because I genuinely like long drives. It was about 6 hours of highway. I left around 5 in the evening, planning to get home around 11. Around 11, I pulled into a rest area off a less traveled stretch of the route. Not one of the big ones with a McDonald's and a Starbucks. One of the small state-run ones, a low brick building with restrooms, a couple of vending machines under a fluorescent overhang, a parking lot with maybe 20 spots, and a separate truck section around the side. There were 4 other cars in the car section when I pulled in. I remember counting idly the way you do. I used the bathroom. I washed my hands. The hand dryer was one of those loud industrial ones that you can hear from outside the building. I walked back out into the parking lot, which was quiet and felt larger at night than it had felt when I pulled in. The kind of fluorescent lighting that makes the asphalt look gray instead of black. A few moths around the lights. I could hear the highway in the distance, but the rest area itself was tucked back behind some trees. and the trees made it feel more isolated than it actually was. I was opening my car door when a man came out of the restroom behind me and called out, "Hey, you got jumper cables by any chance?" I turned around. He was maybe 40, average build, average height, plaid shirt, jeans, work boots, completely ordinary looking. He had his hands in his pockets and he was smiling. The kind of apologetic smile you'd give a stranger when you're about to ask them for a favor. He pointed at a sedan parked 4 or 5 spots down from mine by itself, away from the other cars. "My battery died," he said. "I've been waiting for somebody to come by who might be able to give me a jump." He sounded normal. Slightly tired, slightly embarrassed. The way you'd sound if your battery had actually died at a rest area at night. I had jumper cables in my trunk. I almost said yes. I want to be clear about that. I had my hand on the trunk release and the word "sure" was already most of the way out of my mouth. What stopped me was that, as he was talking, I glanced over at his car and the headlights were on. Not the high beams, not bright, but the parking lights or the running lights or whatever the dim ones are, they were definitely on. The little amber and white glows on the front of the car were visible from where I was standing. I'm not a car person. I want to make that clear too. I don't know much about engines, but I know anyone knows that if your battery is dead, your lights don't work. The car had been sitting there with its lights on, which meant either the battery wasn't dead, or the lights had only been on for a very short time, or something else was going on. I looked back at him, and here's the thing I keep coming back to. He was watching my face. He had been watching my face the whole time he was talking, but in the way that someone making small talk watches your face. Pleasant, expectant. Now he was watching it differently. He was watching it the way you watch a screen when you're waiting for something to load. Focused, patient, reading. I think he saw me notice the lights. I think he saw the exact moment my expression shifted, and his expression did something in response. It didn't change, exactly. It paused, like a video buffering for half a second. The smile stayed on his face, but the eyes did something underneath it, recalculating. Then the smile came back, fuller, like he'd decided to commit to it. "I'm sorry," I said. "I don't have any." "You sure?" he said. He took a small step forward. Not aggressive, just a step. "I'd really appreciate it. I've been here a while." "I'm sure," I said. "Good luck, though." I got into my car. I closed the door. I locked it. I did it manually with the button, even though the doors lock automatically when you start the car, because I wanted them locked. Now, I started the engine. I put it in reverse. He was still standing there in the same spot, watching me. He hadn't moved. He wasn't walking back to his car. He was just watching me back out of my space. I pulled out of the rest area. I got onto the on-ramp. My hands were shaking on the wheel, and I couldn't have told you exactly why. He hadn't done anything. He'd asked me a normal question. I'd said no. That was the entire interaction, start to finish, less than 90 seconds. But here's what was bothering me. In those first few minutes after I pulled away, when I was trying to sort out what had just happened, why was his car parked away from the others? Why not park near the restrooms near other people if you needed help? Why park at the far end off by itself? And why had he come out of the restrooms behind me instead of being at his car waiting? If you're waiting for somebody to give you a jump, you wait by your car. You don't wait in the bathroom unless you're not waiting for somebody to give you a jump. Unless you're waiting for somebody and the somebody just has to be alone. I drove for about an hour. I kept checking my mirrors. The highway was mostly empty by then. A few trucks, a few cars, headlights coming and going. Nothing stayed behind me for long. I started to settle. I started to think I'd overreacted. Maybe the lights had been on a timer. Maybe he'd just turned them on right before I came out. Maybe 100 normal explanations. I stopped at a gas station to fill up. Small one, 2 pumps, a small convenience store, a single attendant inside watching a TV behind the counter. I pulled up to pump 1 and got out. I started the pump. A car pulled in behind me at pump 2. I didn't think anything of it at first. People stop at gas stations. That's what they're for. I was screwing the cap back off and starting the nozzle when I happened to glance over, and the driver of the car at pump 2 was a man in a plaid shirt. I want to be careful here. I did not get a great look at him. I did not see his face clearly. The lighting at the gas station was poor, and he was on the other side of his car from me, and I was actively trying not to stare. Plaid is a common shirt. The car looked different from the sedan at the rest area. Different color. I thought, but I hadn't gotten a great look at the car at the rest area either. I had been looking at the lights, not at the make and model. I couldn't have told you the make and model. I still can't. But I knew, with the immediate certainty that your body has before your brain catches up, that I was not going to finish filling up. I clicked the nozzle off after maybe $4 of gas. I put the nozzle back on the pump. I didn't get a receipt. I got in my car, locked the doors, and pulled out of the station. And I forced myself not to look directly at the other car as I left. I made myself look like a person who had finished, who was leaving, who hadn't noticed anything. I drove for about a mile. Then I took the next exit, which led off into a small town I'd never heard of. I drove through the town, a single main street with a closed diner and a post office and a hardware store with the lights off. I took a right at the end of the main street, then a left 2 blocks later, then another left. I had no destination. I was just driving away from where I had been and waiting to see if any headlights followed me. None did for a while. I drove like that for maybe 20 minutes, taking small roads, doubling back, watching my mirrors. The town gave way to a dark county road with farms on either side. The kind of road where you don't see another car for 10 minutes at a stretch. About 15 minutes into the county road, headlights appeared behind me. They were a good distance back, a quarter mile, maybe more. They could have been anybody. A farmer, a late shift worker, anybody who happened to be on a country road at midnight. But I watched them, and they stayed at about the same distance, neither closing nor falling back. When I sped up slightly, they sped up slightly. When I slowed, they slowed. I want to acknowledge what I know to be true, which is that on a dark rural road with only one car ahead of you, you tend to match speeds. That's just how driving works. Most people don't want to pass on a 2-lane country road in the dark. So the fact that the headlights behind me matched my speed is in itself evidence of nothing. But I was past the point of evidence. I was operating on something older than evidence. I came to a 4-way stop in the middle of nothing. No other cars in sight, except for the headlights behind me. I sat at the stop sign for longer than I needed to. I watched the headlights approach. They slowed, and then they stopped, maybe 50 yards behind me, not pulling up to the stop sign, just stopping in the road. I sat there. They sat there. Neither of us moved. After maybe 20 seconds, I went through the intersection and made a hard right, away from the direction I'd been headed, onto a road I'd never seen before. I watched the mirror. The headlights pulled up to the stop sign. They sat there, and then they turned right, the same way I had. I don't remember the next 20 minutes very well. I remember driving fast. I remember the road going from county road to something narrower, almost a private drive. I remember turning into a farm equipment lot, where there were maybe a dozen tractors parked in rows, and pulling around behind a big combine harvester and killing my lights, and sitting there in the dark with the engine running. A car went past on the road I'd come off of. Maybe 90 seconds later, it was going slowly. I couldn't see the driver. I couldn't see the plaid shirt or not the plaid shirt. I just saw a sedan going slow, and then it was gone. I waited another 15 minutes in the equipment lot. I didn't see any more cars. I pulled out, found my way back to a state route, and got back on the highway from a different on-ramp than the one I'd left from. I drove home the rest of the way without stopping. I got in around 4 in the morning, 3 hours later than I'd planned, and I sat in my own driveway for about 10 minutes before I went inside, watching the street in the rear view. I've told this story to a few people. Most of them have told me, gently, that I was probably fine, that he was probably just a guy with a dead battery, and the parking lights had been on a circuit that hadn't fully drained, that the guy at the gas station was probably a different guy, and plaid is a common shirt, and lots of people have sedans, that the headlights on the country road were probably some farmer, that my fear had constructed a narrative out of unrelated pieces. That's possible. I know that's possible. I've held that possibility in my hand and turned it over many times, but I keep coming back to the pause. The half-second pause when he saw me notice the lights. I keep coming back to the way his car was parked away from the others, and the way he came out of the restroom. Behind me, and the way he was waiting for me to back out of my space before he moved. I keep coming back to the fact that the headlights on the country road turned the same way I did at a stop sign in the middle of nowhere, at midnight, on a road that didn't really lead anywhere except past 3 farms. None of those things individually are proof of anything. I want to be honest about that. I cannot tell you with certainty that I was being hunted. I will never be able to tell you that. The story doesn't end with a face or a name or a moment of confirmation. It ends with me in a farm equipment lot at 1 in the morning, watching a sedan drive past. I don't really know what to do with these stories. None of them have endings. I never found out who was in my apartment. My sister never found out who was in her yard. The man at the rest area, if he was anyone at all, I'll never know who he was or what he was deciding when he looked at me. The thing that bothers me, when I lay them out next to each other like this, is how late I was each time. How long each thing had been going on before I started paying attention. The cigarette smell in my bedroom for weeks before the deadbolt. The bathroom light I kept dismissing as my own forgetfulness. My sister's dog staring at the fence for who knows how long before the first cigarette butt appeared in the grass. The man at the rest area who must have been there for a while before I walked out of the restroom, who had to have been there long enough to have considered other people and dismissed them, and waited for someone like me. In each case, by the time I understood what I was inside, I had already been inside it for a while. That's the part I can't shake. Not the events. The space before the events. The weeks and months when whatever was happening, and I was going about my life, and I didn't know. I lock my doors twice now. I check the back seat of my car before I get in, even in the daytime, even in my own garage. I keep the blinds closed at night. When I come home, I stand in the doorway for a few seconds before I go in, just listening. None of these are big things. None of them cost me anything. But I do them, and I notice that I do them, and I notice that I started doing them after, not before. That's the thing I want to leave you with. Not the stories themselves. The thing the stories themselves taught me, which is the thing I'd ask you to think about tonight when you lock up, and tomorrow when you walk out to your car, and the next time you notice something small in your home that's slightly different than you remember. Most of the time, it's nothing. But you're never the one who gets to know which time is the other time. You only find out afterward, if you find out at all. And there's a version of your life, maybe the one you're living right now, maybe not, where something has already started, and you just haven't noticed yet. That's all I wanted to write down. That's all of it.